everybody. Come and take your seats.
Astrid, don't worry about it. We can take care of you.
Yeah. You take care of it.
Yeah.
Come and take your seats. Welcome to the seminar series. We're very fortunate today to have Astrid Wichmann, who is a visiting scholar. She's currently at Colloquium University in Germany, working with Nicole Rummel, who many of you have met at international meetings. And Rummel was also in Pittsburgh for a long time. You might have met her there, so I think she's lucky to be working with her. And before that, well, originally Astrid got her PhD from Leutner, also in Germany. And she's been working in the area of inquiry, including using some of the web-based inquiry science environment tools, even in her dissertation work. She has worked with both the European community and in the psychology department at Bochum to investigate various aspects of inquiry. And I think we're very fortunate to hear how she has integrated all of these experiences to really think about effective ways to teach and design instruction with regard to inquiry. Today she's going to talk about the role of simulations in inquiry learning. Do possibilities of active variable manipulation enhance learning? Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing
Thank you,
your
Marsha, for the nice introduction. Thanks also for Camellia to give me the opportunity to talk here. I'm very fortunate to be here with the group, with the WISE group since fall, and been doing quite interesting things with WISE, and we've just conducted a study together. It's quite a luxury in the WISE group that you have different people with different levels of expertise, and I can take this expertise and, like, depending on the expertise that I need, I can ask different people. So it has been really a lot of fun and very exciting. And I'm also excited to stay here for one more month to analyze the data that we just conducted. For today, I thought it would be most interesting for you guys if I talk about my work in the area of inquiry learning, especially computer-supported inquiry learning, and the experiences that I had with designing simulations and also evaluating simulations and looking at the added value of using simulations within the area of inquiry learning. I will talk about a small study that I've conducted with a student of mine, Sebastian Timpe, but before that I thought I'd share a little bit also the experiences during the past years in different types of projects. Starting with a project, it's an EU finance project called Connect that I participated in. It was a very big project that was focusing on informal learning within the area of science education, where the idea was to improve and augment existing exhibits within science museums and science centers. And actually worked there with a simulation as well, but it's a specific kind of simulation. We augmented an exhibit that you can see here in the middle. It's a computer-controlled plant growth chamber called BioTube, and it was situated in Sweden in a small science center. And we used this exhibit to augment it with virtual representations representing photosynthesis to show what kind of components go into the plant and what kind of components go outside of the plant. What you can see here are students wearing augmented reality technology. Please keep in mind it's 2005, so it was a little bit more bigger than the glasses that you can see now in the news. Also, what they are wearing is a backpack, and in the backpack is a notebook with a server and the software running the simulation. So it was a little bit...
That was perfectly normal.
Yeah, the students enjoyed it, as you can see. It was very exciting. What the students could do, they could not only see the visualizations through these glasses, they could also manipulate the greenhouse, the BioTube, using an interface. So what you see on this screenshot is actually what the students have seen in the virtual environment using the augmented reality glasses. On the left side is a menu, and the student could pick different menus and, for instance, make predictions and then manipulate variables and then run the experiment. The student could interact with the BioTube by switching on and off the light. So they could change light intensity. It was just one variable that the students could change, but they could change it on different levels from 0 light intensity to medium to full light intensity. And then based on their variable manipulation, they could also read the data afterwards. And the data is displayed on top of the biotube, showing the level of CO2 and the level of oxygen and the time lapsed during the experiment. And depending on the experiment that the students were running, we were visualizing or like showing the process of photosynthesis by either reducing or accumulating the CO2 molecules and oxygen molecules within the biotube. So imagine that the students would switch off, imagine that the students would start an experiment with the lights switched off and then would start the experiment by switching to full light intensity. The student could observe the CO2 intake by, and we displayed that with the orange bubbles, so the students could see how the CO2 molecules would disappear and how the O2 molecules would accumulate at the same time. So that was a certain kind of simulation that is maybe a little bit out of the box. Here's an overlay. You can see, like you can imagine, these both views are overlaid on top of each other, and this was the augmented reality visualization and the exhibit that they would see through the glasses. Another simulation I've been working with that you guys, I think, are pretty familiar with is BioBlast. BioBlast is a simulation developed by NASA. It's actually working with real NASA data, like the model behind it is using real data collected by NASA. The focus on this project was, however, not so much the simulation, it was the inquiry cycle itself. I was particularly interested in the students' explanations during an inquiry cycle. So I was using 2 different kinds of software. The software on the left side is Freestyler. It's a scripting environment developed at the University of Duisburg-Essen by Ulrich Hoffe in the computer science department, and was structuring an inquiry cycle to help students to go from formulating a research question to coming up with a hypothesis to running an experiment, then displaying the data, comparing the data to the previously formulated hypothesis, and then interpreting the results. Here, BioBlast was the simulation. However, it has been only basically been used to get the data. So they were running the experiments, but the emphasis was not so much on variable manipulation, even though BioBlast is using these possibilities. What I did during the study was I was comparing different types of prompts, and I was seeing how these prompts would affect learning outcome, but also the quality of the explanations. And particularly, I compared self-explanation prompts with metacognitive prompts, and I found that metacognitive prompts, which are also like more specific prompts, would be more helpful, and students would come up with more complex ideas with respect to justifications and inferences regarding the inquiry cycle. In another EU finance project called Science Created by You, it's a small, like also called SKY project, we worked with simulations as well. SKY has been initiated by Ton de Jong and Wouter van Joling at the University of Twente. The idea of SKY and SKY Lab was to send students on a mission to find out how to make healthy pizza or how to reduce emissions. Skylab had different kinds of tools, and the missions that we developed were for missions across domains, so across physics, chemistry, and biology. Within Sky, there were different tools available, concept mapping tools, ways to share ideas, but also a simulation tool. And my focus within this project was a simulation tool called the CO2-friendly house. And the simulation tool students had the possibility to change different variables that help to determine the insulation level of a house, so they could optimize condition towards insulation to reduce energy loss within a house. They, for instance, could change the thickness of the insulation. They could choose the type of insulation, like, for instance, different kinds of rock wool. And then they also could measure energy loss or energy efficiency by running experiments. During this project, I was working with the Collide group at the University of Duisburg-Essen. It's a in the computer science department. And my colleagues came up with an agent-based framework. It's actually agent-based in the sense of software agents, so it wasn't really agents that you would see. But these agents would help to detect the behavior of students while running simulation experiments. So one agent was, for example, the VOTAT agent, and VOTAT standing for variable one thing at a time. The VOTAT agent was detecting whether a student was changing a variable systematically by just changing one variable or changing several variables, which would be unsystematic behavior. Then we also had another another agent that is called canonical monitor, that would detect whether students would change the variable with different distances between the changing. So if they would change, for instance, when we talk about light intensity, from 1 to 2, and then from 2 to 5, and then from 5 to 6, then this would be non-canonical because the distance between the changing the levels would be different. So we would detect that as well. Then another agent would propose certain kinds of support. So while the first two agents were detecting a certain kind of behavior, another agent was responsible for picking up this information and then proposing a certain kind of support, which was like some kind of prompt to say like, oh, okay, try to change your try to just change one variable at a time, for instance. So these were the kinds of simulations I've been working with, and as you can see, simulations can be used in very different ways. You can use them to collect data, but you can also use them to engage them in active experimentation to actually change variables. And if you think of inquiry learning, and what we try to do in inquiry learning is to actually engage students in active experimentation, so simulations would be a great tool to do so. Simulations are programs that include a model of natural processes, so simulations usually represent the world in some kind of way and have a model of the world, and students have the possibility to manipulate this model in a certain way, and then based on this manipulation you get a certain outcome of an experiment and you can interpret those data. That is a very nice feature, and if you compare it to animations, for instance, in animations you don't have this possibility. In animations you would watch a certain process going on. You don't even have to have a model that is behind an animation, because you're basically displaying one process, and what the student can do, the student can press start and stop and rewind, but would not be able to change a variable. So it's a very distinct feature within simulations that we should maybe pay more attention to, or investigate whether this is actually of added value to the learner. So from a theoretical perspective, when you look at how in inquiry learning, how research is looking at variable manipulation, you can often read that variable manipulation helps students to actively construct knowledge, to engage in deep processing, and therefore we could hope for higher knowledge gains because students actively construct knowledge. Now the question is whether this is actually true, and if you look at the existing studies investigating this aspect of variable manipulation, there are a lot of studies out there. However, the study results are quite inconsistent. There's a study by Claudia Nerdl. She's from the University of Kiel. She just became a professor in Munich. She looked at the value of simulations by comparing simulations and animations during a sequence of studies, and found quite inconsistent results. So in one experiment she found that students were actually better working with simulations, and then in another experiment where she had different types of support, she found the opposite, where actually students working with animations outperformed the simulation group. So results are quite inconsistent, and the question is, why is that? Like, why don't we find out why is there not consistent empirical evidence showing that, why simulations work? A hypothesis that we had was that maybe the engagement in simulation, working with simulations, yield a certain kind of knowledge that we don't assess. Usually what we do during assessment, during a study, we use a traditional knowledge test. For instance, we assess conceptual knowledge or declarative knowledge. Maybe for working with simulations, we need to have some kind of other type of knowledge that needs to be assessed, and therefore we conducted this study. Swag and Guillaume conducted several studies looking at the quality of knowledge that is shown when students work with simulations, and the colleagues argued that working with simulations or working in inquiry learning in general yields this certain kind of knowledge called intuitive knowledge. And intuitive knowledge is something that is developed when you are anticipating certain events. So when you look at the process, or when you're in a certain situation and you ask this question, what happens if a certain situation takes place? So what happens if the reaction rate, if you increase temperature, for instance? And the question is whether maybe this intuitive knowledge and assessing this intuitive knowledge would help us to find out whether variable manipulation is a key factor that contributes to the added value of simulations. So you could argue in different ways that manipulating variables during experimentation has an advantage, or maybe it has a disadvantage. From a desirable difficulty perspective, you could argue that changing variables during experimentation has a positive effect, because students engage in an activity that might be difficult, that might require additional mental resources, but eventually this engagement would lead to better learning in the end. It might slow down the process, it might lead to difficulties during the process, but in the end the students would benefit from it, and therefore variable manipulation would be beneficial. Quite like the research that Björk and colleagues have done on assessment, you could argue assessment, like taking tests, Björk and colleagues would argue taking tests is not only a way to assess learning, but also a way to engage in learning. So they argue that by accessing memory, by taking tests, is one way to learn better than actually by just looking at a video or looking at a lecture. And in the same way, you might be able to argue that engaging in variable manipulation and testing your hypotheses would help you to engage in certain kind of thinking processes that help you to better understand what's going on within the scientific phenomenon. But then on the other hand, from a cognitive load perspective, of course, you could also argue that engaging the students in this additional task of variable manipulation just leads to drawing on additional mental resources, and since working memory is limited, this could also lead to mental exhaustion. So by asking the students to manipulate variables, this is of course a very challenging task, especially for students who have less experiences or low prior knowledge. And then in addition to that, if the students would run the experiments and manipulate variables unsystematically, the results would not be interpretable. So that's another thing to think about, that cognitive effort that is invested during variable manipulation could also have a negative effect and actually lead to mental exhaustion. Based on these two aspects, that first, intuitive knowledge is maybe the kind of knowledge that is important during working with simulations, and based on the idea that cognitive effort maybe plays a role while learning with simulations, we came up with 3 different hypotheses. The first one was that variable manipulation actually increases cognitive effort. The next hypothesis was that increased knowledge gain, that variable manipulation would lead to increased knowledge gain. And therefore, we could also say that it leads to learning, but we also only said that with respect to intuitive knowledge. Then we had a third hypothesis that maybe students need to be prepared better beforehand during experimentation to actually make use of this possibility to manipulate variables. So that was a third hypothesis, to say maybe a preparation before experimentation during the hypothesis phase would help the students to better benefit from this variable manipulation, and therefore this would lead to a higher knowledge gain, even though also maybe to increased cognitive effort, but this increased cognitive effort would pay off because students would actually learn from this variable manipulation. You guys have questions so far? Okay. What I didn't tell you guys yet, comes a little bit late, this is what psychologists do, content comes in the end. I think you guys would do this differently. We conducted the study in the area of chemistry, and we chose the topic of chemistry, in particular molecular chemistry, because students have problems with understanding chemistry on a molecular level. Especially when students should understand aspects like catalysis or pasteurization, it's also important that they have an understanding of what energy actually is. And students have problems to understand the terminology of what energy is, like on a day-to-day basis, but also on a molecular basis. So students, for instance, assume often that energy is something that is consumed, though energy is converted in another kind of energy, for instance, such as kinetic energy. So simulations can help to make these processes visible and to better understand what's going on the molecular level during pasteurization and catalysis. There's another reason why simulations are important. One is that it's making these processes visible, but also another aspect that I was talking about. It's helping to actually really engage in active experimentation. For the study, we worked with a software called Molecular Workbench. I think most of you will know it's developed by Concord Consortium. And we used an existing project called Reaction Rates that most of you might know as well. And I think it's also partially implemented in WISE as well. Students, we adapted this project by basically structuring the project into different kinds of inquiry phases, going from a research question to a hypothesis, to an experimentation phase, to a results phase. And the students during those inquiry cycles investigated different kinds of aspects, including bond energy and activation energy, pasteurization and catalysis. The study was conducted in Germany with 4 school classes, and we randomly assigned students to different conditions that you can see here. We first had a no variable manipulation group and a variable manipulation group. The only difference between those both groups is that students in the no variable manipulation group were not able to manipulate and change variables, so they could look at the simulation and only press start, stop, and rewind. So it's basically like an animation. And then in the variable manipulation group, students actually had the possibility to change variables, and they could do so, and could also press stop at the same time. Then we had a third condition. This is the variable manipulation plus condition. Here we try to argue that maybe preparing the learner beforehand during this experimentation, during the hypothesis phase, would help them to profit more and to benefit more from this variable manipulation. So instead of just giving them a certain kind of hypothesis, we gave them some kind of drop-down menu, like a multiple choice question where they could choose the hypothesis by themselves.
Astrid?
Mm-hmm.
In the no variable manipulation group, did they see all possible combinations of the variables?
Good question. I'll show you. So with respect to your question, what I have to explain as well, students in the variable manipulation condition were not allowed to do all sorts of things. We basically gave them the possibility to change one variable at a time, and that's it. So they couldn't really manipulate all over the place. They just had one variable that they could change. In order to have fair conditions with respect to information, and this is answering your question, we chose a yoke design in the no variable manipulation condition where we showed two different kinds of animations. In one animation, we showed the possibility when this certain factor is added, which is here the catalyst, and in the other animation, this catalyst was not added. And these were basically the both possibilities, and running these both animations would give them the correct answer or like the correct result. Within the variable manipulation condition, however, students were restrained to this one variable that they could change, but they could do this by themselves. And they were also, we gave them information that how they could do this. With respect to the variable manipulation plus condition, these were the two, sorry, this is German, this doesn't help me very much. We gave them, during the hypothesis phase, we gave them a multiple choice question, and during the other both conditions, we gave them the hypothesis at hand, so they didn't actually have to choose it by themselves. We used two different kinds of instruments for assessing intuitive knowledge. We used the what-if format suggested by Swag and Lyon to assess intuitive knowledge. You see some kind of example here, what will happen if the bond energy of molecule A is higher by a chemical reaction of the atoms A to molecule A2. And then for assessing cognitive effort, we used a questionnaire by Detlef Urhane assessing cognitive effort at two times during the treatment. So here you have an overview of the procedure. We started with an introduction, then we had what we call a so-called knowledge acquisition phase. We assumed that students, so in order for inquiry to work in general, students need to have some kind of knowledge, some kind of prior knowledge. So we had in the first cycle where they were introduced in the basics of chemical reactions, and then afterwards we had the pretest assessing intuitive knowledge, and after the pretest we started the treatment with the three conditions where they engaged in three more inquiry cycles within those conditions, and then afterwards we had the post-test, administered the post-test. With respect to results, regarding pretest, we had no differences between groups, so I was happy about that. And we also had pre-post differences in all three groups, and these were actually all significant differences. So even the no variable manipulation group significantly learned more from pre to post. With respect to intuitive knowledge, we first did a multivariate analysis, a Mancover, and found differences. And then also we found differences between classes. So we used class as a factor for the next ANOVA that we calculated. So within the ANOVA was actually an UNCOVA where we used class as a control factor. Here found differences as well. And then the postdoc comparisons showed the following results. As you can see, both conditions with the possibility to manipulate variables outperformed the condition with no possibility of variable manipulation. However, there was no difference and no significant difference between the variable manipulation and the variable manipulation plus. So yes, we could show that with respect to intuitive knowledge, variable manipulation was helpful, but with respect to our additional activation, we could not show that they were actually better than the condition with variable manipulation alone. This is basically the same again. Then we also looked at cognitive effort. In this questionnaire, we asked them how hard or how challenging or stringent did they perceive these activities, and how stringent was it working with the learning environment. As you see here on the results go into the right direction. The way we would hypothesize is that variable manipulation was more difficult or more strenuous than working in the no variable manipulation condition. However, we don't have any significant differences here, so only descriptively we can say manipulating variables was perceived as more difficult. Then also, and we actually didn't want to have that, working in the variable manipulation plus group, so preparing the learner was also more difficult than being not prepared. So as a conclusion, we could find positive effects concerning intuitive knowledge. So it seemed that variable manipulation indeed had some additional benefit, but also required additional cognitive resources. Whether we could argue that variable manipulation is really a desirable difficulty is hard to say, because first of all, we didn't find significant differences with respect to cognitive effort, and also I believe that we need to have more evidence on the behavior side, on what the students actually did during experimentation, to see whether experimentation or variable manipulation was indeed a desirable difficulty. Then the hypothesis that an active hypothesis phase, or like preparing the learner, would contribute to making more use of the experimentation. We could not show this, and maybe one reason is that just adding a multiple choice item is not sufficient for preparing the learner. So we should think about something else here to prepare the learner. Yeah.
Can you go back 2 slides?
Which one?
Can you just... No, next one. That one. Nope. The graph. Nope. The effort one. Yeah, there you go. Wait, what's on this? Can you tell me about this measure a little more?
We used a questionnaire.
Yeah.
With 3 different items.
Right.
And we had 2 times where we measured cognitive effort during the treatment. So we had time 1 and a time 2, and then we you can see them both here.
What are the items like?
Actually, do I have them? So an item is like, I think that working with the learning environment is difficult, or I think that the topic that we're currently, that the activities that we're doing are very difficult to do.
Is it possible that even in the no VM condition that they they were really referring to the difficulty of the concepts involved and not necessarily how active they were. Like maybe this wasn't sensitive to the difference in the actual difficulty of what they're doing as opposed to what the material is.
Right, so with respect to sensitivity, the questionnaire covered the learning, the effort concerning learning environments, the effort concerning the topic that they were actually studying, and the effort concerning the activities. However, looking at the differences, I mean, of course, I looked at the differences between the items. I could not find big differences, so it was a high correlation, and they just answered them all in a very similar way.
But do you believe that's right? Do you feel like the students in the conditions had equal amounts of effort, or you think that maybe that didn't get at it?
I think that variable manipulation was more difficult and it was more strenuous, but to pick this up with the questionnaire on just perceived effort by just asking them is just not sensitive enough. So what I would have needed to have is some kind of behavior detection, what you guys have in WISE, that I can actually look at what the kids are doing during experimentation. That would have been very helpful.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'm curious though, like, how difficult is this on the rating? Like, what was the maximum level of cognitive effort they could achieve?
5.
Okay, so it's pretty high, but not like.
Right, it could be.
I wonder if it's possible that, like, since it was sort of middling for them, it maybe wasn't, like, is it possible it wasn't difficult enough to get, like, variation? They all just found it, like, kind of okay, or?
I don't think I had floor effects, if you mean that. So,
Okay.
but just the differences in general were not as big between the conditions, and I think that was the biggest problem. But also, if I would have, again, like it was a questionnaire with 3 items, and then to insert them 2 times during the treatment, that's not very much in general. So more questions. If I only have the possibility of a questionnaire, I should have used more questions, I think.
Can you say again which variables the students could manipulate in the simulation?
Right, so they during the treatment they had 3 cycles where they engaged in experimentation. And one cycle was about pasteurization, one cycle was about catalysis, and the other one was about bond energy. And during, for instance, during catalysis, they were allowed to insert the factor of the catalyst. And you could see what's happening if you insert a catalyst during the experiment. And in pasteurization, the question was like, how high can the temperature be to actually destroy the molecules that are responsible for that the milk goes bad, and how low does it have to be to actually keep the milk molecules alive that you need so that it tastes well. So, but again, it was only one factor.
So it's catalysis, pasteurization, and the other one was?
Bond energy. It was like an introductory simulation where it wasn't really about a certain topic. It was in general about reaction rates, where it's also about changing temperature.
I agree that maybe more questions may be needed to figure out how students rated the effort involved. Marcia wrote about deceptive clarity. Do you think one of the reasons why, with no variable manipulation, the students may find it easier is because they may think they understand it by just looking at the screen, and by when they manipulate a variable, do you think they're more aware of their misunderstandings?
That was basically the hypothesis that we had, that by engaging the student within variable manipulation, they would need to make the effort to think about and make sense of the factors and about the different factors and the relationship between the variables involved within an experiment. As in comparison to an animation, you could just watch and maybe don't pay attention at all. That was
you think, oh, it looks easy, and I think I understand it.
Right, yeah. And it's a very good suggestion. I actually should include that. I'm just working on a publication, so I should include the aspect of deceptive clarity as well.
Marcia wrote about it in 2011. It's pretty
Thank
cool.
you. Yes, thanks.
strikes me that there may be a couple of different things that you could be looking at that may or may not be helped by a simulation. So for instance, if you're just looking at the breaking of a bond and reforming of another bond, like the A2B2 thing, that sometimes having a bunch of molecules bouncing around together actually can inhibit your understanding relative to, say, a series of diagrams that shows,
Yes.
you know, that. And I often find that, you know, when people are looking at a whole bunch of things bouncing around, they don't know what's going on. You need that sort of like elemental element aspect. Now I can imagine how some aspects of like pasteurization, where, you know, heat is kind of a molar entity, you know, the movement of molecules or average movement of molecules, where a simulation might be more useful. The part of catalysis, I see that maybe more like the bond energy thing, where a single diagram, at least to start them, might help, where they realize that the catalyst is inert, it's not changing, but it's facilitating the breaking and reforming of bonds. And I can imagine you could build up from the simple diagrams to a simulation with a bunch of molecules.
Right.
Is that
So that you make a progression from very simple, that you start with static pictures, and then once they got that, then you would go to the more complex aspects.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that the questions were a little bit different during pasteurization. It was an optimization question. How much temperature can you actually add so you can keep the right molecules alive to have good milk?
Mm-hmm.
And then during catalysis, it was about just adding one factor and see what's happening. So yeah, I think starting with pictures and then progressing to more complex activities is a very good idea. Yeah.
I'm curious about the students with when you said that you expected a negative outcome for those students that didn't have much prior knowledge. So, and then in the pre-assessment, you noticed that there was, I think they scored similarly all groups in the test.
Right.
But I was just curious about, for those students that didn't score high, did you notice like a high increase in their knowledge after in the post-test, or was it similar for all groups?
So what you're asking is whether I looked at the low performers, whether the low performers also had an increase.
Yeah.
And I did not make a split between
Yeah,
the population. It's a good suggestion to look at that. No, I didn't do that.
It's really very interesting. So you've done a lot of different work on inquiry and visualization, and I guess if you're going to put it all together, what would you say is the most promising way? I mean, you've got lots of individual findings, but if you're going to synthesize them, what would you say would be the best way to support inquiry with visualization?
The reason why I did this study was that I found in the past projects that variable manipulation is an important factor. I know from my colleagues in Germany, especially the hardcore psychologists, they use simulations in a very different way than you do and than I want to do as well. Is that they say like, okay, the simulation, the part where you get the data, this is not important. Important is what is before and after. And you use the simulation to get the data, you script the students through what is to be done to get the data, and that's it.
They don't really benefit from the visualization.
Right, and this is based on this understanding that also that you can argue as well what Anderson is saying, that when you engage in activities and you have low prior knowledge and you do a lot of mistakes in the beginning, then you will be unable to actually acquire new knowledge. So in the beginning, when you have low prior knowledge, you should script the learner through and not give so much freedom to actually engage in activities by yourselves, which is true. I mean, if you have a knowledge test only, then this is exactly what you would get. However, I think opportunities to make sense, this is the core idea of inquiry learning. So why shouldn't you use a simulation for exactly that purpose? And so I think focusing on this manipulation of variables and trying to find the optimal way to give them freedom to to actually manipulate variables by themselves, but also support them. This is one important aspect. And what what your colleague said, to do this model progression aspect where you start with a simple picture and then you go from a static picture to an animation to a simulation to increase complexity is also a good way to help learners to engage in active knowledge construction.
Okay. Any more questions? Thank you very much.